The courtroom doors swing open. David Whitmore's breath catches. The maid he fired 3 years ago walks in wearing designer armor. She's suing for custody of his twin sons and ownership of his family estate. Naomi Carter meets his eyes. The help isn't asking for mercy. She's taking everything. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The rain hit Naomi Carter's face like tiny needles as she stood outside the iron gates of the Whitmore estate, her cardboard suitcase already falling apart in her trembling hands. She had exactly $47 in her pocket, a bus ticket stub, and a letter of recommendation from a woman who died 3 weeks ago. The mansion loomed ahead like something out of a Gothic novel, all sharp angles and cold stone, windows that looked like judging eyes. She pressed the buzzer and waited, her thin coat doing nothing against the October chill that cut straight through to her bones. The intercom crackled to life with a static pop that made her jump. Yes? The voice was clipped, efficient, the kind that had no time for pleasantries. Naomi cleared her throat, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'm here about the housekeeping position. My name is Naomi Carter. Mrs. Harrison sent me. There was a long pause. So long Naomi thought maybe the connection had died. Then the gates buzzed and began their slow swing open, metal groaning against metal in a sound that felt like a warning. The driveway stretched forever, lined with perfectly manicured hedges that probably cost more to maintain than Naomi had earned in her entire life. Her shoes, the only pair she owned that weren't completely destroyed, squelched against the wet pavement. By the time she reached the front entrance, a woman in her 50s stood waiting, arms crossed, face set in an expression that suggested she'd already decided Naomi wasn't good enough. You're late, the woman said, though Naomi had arrived exactly on time. I'm Mrs. Reynolds, head of household staff. Mrs. Harrison called about you before she passed. God rest her soul. Said you were reliable, hard-working. I hope she wasn't wrong. Naomi bit back the response that wanted to escape. That Mrs. Harrison had been like family, that losing her had been like losing the last person in the world who gave a damn whether she lived or died. Instead, she just nodded. I won't disappoint you, ma'am. Mrs. Reynolds gave her a look that could have frozen fire, then turned sharply on her heel and walked inside. Naomi followed, trying not to gape at the marble floors, the crystal chandelier that hung in the entrance hall like a frozen waterfall, the sweeping staircase that curved upward into shadows. Everything smelled of lemon polish and money, that particular scent of wealth that couldn't be faked or bought. The rules are simple, Mrs. Reynolds said without looking back. You're here to work, not to be seen or heard. Mr. Whitmore values his privacy above all else. You'll report at 6 every morning, your duties will be outlined daily, and you'll leave by 8 in the evening unless there's a special event. You'll use the service entrance, never the main doors. You'll eat your meals in the staff quarters. And most importantly, you'll stay out of Mr. Whitmore's way. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Naomi said, though something in her bristled at being told to make herself invisible. She'd spent her whole life being told to take up less space, to speak more quietly, to be grateful for whatever scraps were thrown her way. At 26, she was tired of it, bone-tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. But she needed this job more than pride or dignity. So she swallowed the bitterness and followed Mrs. Reynolds deeper into the house. Your room is in the west wing, 3rd floor, Mrs. Reynolds said, stopping in front of a narrow door. It's small, but it's clean. You'll share a bathroom with the other staff. Dinner is at 7 in the kitchen. Don't be late. She handed Naomi a key that felt too light to open anything important, and walked away without another word. Naomi unlocked the door and stepped into what would be her new home. Small was generous. The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed pushed against one wall, a dresser with 3 drawers that stuck when she tried to open them, and a window so tiny it might as well have been decorative. But it was warm, and it was dry, and it was hers, which was more than she'd had in months. She set her disintegrating suitcase on the bed and sat beside it, letting herself have exactly 1 minute to feel the weight of everything she'd lost. Then she stood up, straightened her spine, and went to find a uniform that would transform her into exactly what this house needed her to be. Invisible. Dinner in the staff kitchen was a quiet affair. There were 4 others, Two older women who'd worked at the estate for decades and barely acknowledged Naomi's existence. A young man named Thomas, who gave her a sympathetic smile, and a girl around Naomi's age named Clara, who couldn't stop talking about how handsome Mr. Whitmore was, how tragic it was that he'd never remarried after his wife died. "He won't," one of the older women said flatly. Her name was Margaret, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd seen every foolish hope crumble into dust. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't see staff. We're furniture to him. Useful furniture, but furniture all the same. Better you remember that now, girl, before you get ideas above your station." Clara blushed and went back to her soup, but Naomi caught the dreamy look that hadn't quite left her eyes. Naomi had learned a long time ago that exceptions didn't exist for girls like them, that fairy tales were written by people who'd never had to clean someone else's toilet. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Naomi stared at the ceiling and made herself a promise. She would work harder than anyone else, would prove herself indispensable, would save every penny until she had enough to start over somewhere far away from here, somewhere she could build a life that belonged to her and no one else. The next morning, Naomi met David Whitmore for the first time, and every assumption she'd made about him shattered. She was polishing the banister in the main hall when he came down the stairs, talking rapidly into his phone, his other hand adjusting his tie with impatient efficiency. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, sharp jawline, expensive suit. He was objectively handsome in that way wealthy men often were, polished and utterly sure of their place in the world. He walked right past her without a glance, his voice carrying back. "I don't care what the board thinks, Martin. The merger happens on my terms, or it doesn't happen at all. I didn't build this company by compromising." His footsteps faded toward his private office, and she went back to polishing, back to being invisible, back to being nothing. The days fell into a rhythm that was almost meditative in its monotony. Wake at 5:30, dress in the black uniform with white apron, report to Mrs. Reynolds for assignments, work until her hands were raw and her feet ached, eat a quick meal, work some more, retreat to her tiny room. David Whitmore remained a ghost, a presence she felt more than saw, a voice on the phone, footsteps in distant hallways. 3 weeks in, everything changed. Naomi was changing linens in one of the guest bedrooms, humming quietly to herself, when the door burst open and David stormed in, phone pressed to his ear, face twisted with barely contained rage. "I said no, Gregory." "The answer is no." He ended the call with enough force that she heard the phone case crack, and only then did he seem to notice her standing there, frozen with a pillowcase clutched in her hands. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. Naomi found her voice, though it came out smaller than she wanted. "I'm Naomi, sir. I'm part of the housekeeping staff. I didn't realize anyone was using this room. I can come back later if—" "Save it." He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Just finish and get out. And for God's sake, stop humming. It's distracting." The unfairness of it hit her like a slap. She'd been hired to do a job, was doing that job exactly as instructed, and now she was being reprimanded for the crime of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Something hot and sharp rose in her chest, and before she could stop herself, she heard herself say, "I wasn't aware my humming was loud enough to penetrate your phone conversation, sir. Perhaps you were looking for a reason to be irritated, and I happened to be convenient." The silence that followed was so complete, Naomi could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. David turned to face her fully, and for the first time, he actually looked at her, really looked, his eyes narrowing. "Did you just—" He started, then stopped, tilted his head. "What's your name again?" "Naomi Carter." She lifted her chin, refusing to back down. "And I apologize if my humming disturbed you, but I'm just trying to do my job, sir." Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to identify. Then he did something she didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh, wasn't warm or friendly, but it was genuine, a sharp bark of sound. "Naomi Carter," he repeated. "Well, Naomi Carter, I appreciate the honesty, even if it is wildly inappropriate. Tell me, do you always talk back to your employers, or am I special?" Only when they're being unreasonable, she said before she could stop herself, and immediately wanted to sink through the floor. What was she doing? This was exactly how people got fired. But instead of exploding, David laughed again. Fair enough. Carry on then. But maybe keep the humming to a minimum. I have a headache that could kill a small elephant. And with that, he walked out, leaving Naomi standing there with her heart still racing. That night at dinner, Thomas leaned over and whispered, I heard you told off Mr. Whitmore today. Word travels fast in this house. You've become legendary. Naomi felt her stomach drop. I didn't tell him off. I just spoke my mind. It was stupid. It was brilliant, Thomas said with a grin. Do you know how many people work here and never once look him in the eye? You treated him like a human being instead of a god. That takes guts. The next morning she arrived at work expecting to find a termination notice, but instead, Mrs. Reynolds handed her a new assignment. Mr. Whitmore has requested that you handle the cleaning of his private office and study. You'll start this morning. Her tone suggested she didn't approve. And Naomi, don't make me regret vouching for you. David's office was exactly what she expected. All dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with volumes that looked like they'd never been read. A desk the size of a small car positioned in front of windows that overlooked the estate's gardens. He wasn't there when she arrived, which was a relief. She could do her job without the weight of his presence. She was dusting his desk when she noticed the photograph in a silver frame, half hidden behind a stack of files. It showed a woman, blonde and beautiful, smiling at the camera with joy that seemed to radiate from the image. She was holding 2 infants, tiny bundles wrapped in blue blankets, and the love in her eyes was so fierce it made Naomi's chest ache. This was David's wife, the one who died, and these were his sons. Tragic story, isn't it? The voice behind her made Naomi jump, nearly knocking the frame over. David stood in the doorway, jacket off, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. She died giving birth to them. Aneurysm. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done, that it was just one of those things. But that doesn't make it any less senseless. I'm sorry, Naomi said, and meant it. She knew what it was like to lose people. I shouldn't have been looking. It's private. It's a photograph on my desk, David said, walking further into the room. Not exactly hidden in a vault. He picked up the frame, his thumb tracing over the glass. That was Sarah. And those are my sons, Alexander and Benjamin. They're 3 now, wild as wolves and twice as destructive. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. They don't remember her, of course. They'll grow up with nothing but stories and pictures, and sometimes I wonder if that's better or worse. Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just kept dusting, kept moving, kept being the invisible help even as every instinct screamed that this moment required something more. Do you have family, Naomi? He asked without turning around. The question caught her off guard, personal in a way that felt like crossing a line. I did, she said carefully. Not anymore. They're gone. Gone, he repeated softly. That's a diplomatic way of putting it. Death, distance, or choice. All 3, depending on which family member you're asking about. Naomi surprised herself with the honesty. My mother died when I was 16. Cancer. My father couldn't handle it, started drinking, got mean. I left when I was 18 and never looked back. No siblings, no grandparents, no one who wanted the burden of a girl with too much anger and not enough opportunities. And yet here you are, David said, finally turning to face her. Cleaning my office and telling me when I'm being unreasonable. That takes either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity. I haven't decided which. Maybe both, Naomi said with a small smile. I've been told I have poor survival instincts. Something shifted in David's expression, something that might have been respect or might have been interest. This was dangerous territory, this moment of connection, of seeing and being seen. I should finish, she said, breaking the moment. Unless you need me to leave? No, David said, moving back to his desk. Stay. I have work to do, and I find that your presence is less irritating than most. Consider that high praise. Consider it noted, sir. He looked up sharply at the sir, something flashing in his eyes. My name is David. You can use it when we're alone. I'm not a tyrant despite what the staff probably says. Yes, sir, Naomi said deliberately, and was rewarded with a huff of what might have been laughter. Over the next few weeks, a pattern emerged. David started spending more time in his office when she was cleaning, working quietly while she dusted and organized, occasionally asking her opinion on things that seemed designed to test her. Should I fire my marketing director for incompetence or give him one more chance? He asked one afternoon. Depends, Naomi said carefully. Is he incompetent? Or is he just being set up to fail by insufficient resources and impossible expectations? David paused mid-signature and looked at her with raised eyebrows. That's an oddly specific distinction. I've worked a lot of jobs. I've seen a lot of people blamed for systemic failures that had nothing to do with their actual abilities. Sometimes the problem isn't the person, but the system they're trying to navigate. And if the system is fine and the person is just incompetent, then fire him, she said simply. But make sure you're honest about why, and make sure the next person you hire has what they need to succeed. Otherwise, you're just repeating the same pattern and expecting different results. David stared at her for a long moment, then went back to his paperwork. I'll take that under advisement. 3 days later, Naomi heard that the marketing director had been let go, but given a generous severance and a recommendation. It was a small thing, but Naomi felt a tiny glow of satisfaction. Then one morning, everything tilted sideways. She arrived at David's office to find him pacing like a caged animal, phone to his ear, voice tight with barely leashed panic. I don't care what it takes, find them. Now. He hung up and immediately dialed again, fingers shaking. Is everything okay? She asked, forgetting her place. David spun to face her, and she saw real fear in his eyes. The nanny didn't show up this morning, and I have a board meeting in an hour that I absolutely cannot miss, and the twins are... Where are the twins? In the nursery upstairs, probably destroying everything in reach. They're 3, Naomi. They're tornadoes in human form. I can't leave them alone, but I can't reschedule this meeting. If I don't close this deal today, 6 months of work goes down the drain, and 200 employees lose their jobs. He looked at her with desperation. I need help. Naomi made a decision that would change everything. I'll watch them. Just until you find a replacement. I'm good with kids. I used to babysit all the time. David stared at her like she'd just offered him the moon. You'd do that? Someone needs to. And I'm here, and they need supervision. It's not complicated. It's wildly inappropriate, David said, but he was already moving toward the door, already accepting because he had no other choice. Mrs. Reynolds will have an aneurysm when she finds out. Then don't tell her until after, Naomi suggested. I'll take full responsibility. David paused in the doorway. Thank you, he said, and it sounded like he meant more than just the immediate favor. I won't forget this. The nursery was chaos incarnate. Naomi stood in the doorway taking in the scene. Toys everywhere, building blocks scattered like landmines, 2 identical little boys with dark curly hair and their father's sharp jawline, currently engaged in a serious argument about who got to play with a stuffed elephant that had definitely seen better days. They looked up when she entered, eyes widening in identical expressions of curiosity mixed with suspicion. Who are you? One of them demanded. I'm Naomi, she said, crouching down to their level. Your dad had to go to an important meeting, so I'm going to hang out with you guys for a little while. Is that okay? The boys looked at each other in that way twins often did, communicating in a language only they understood. Then the one without the elephant spoke. I'm Alexander. He's Benjamin. But everyone calls him Benji except Dad when he's in trouble. Are you going to make us take a nap? Because we don't want to take a nap. Naomi bit back a smile. No nap. But maybe we could clean up some of these toys and then do something fun. What do you guys like to do? Build stuff, Alexander said immediately. And tell stories. And go outside. Can we go outside? It's a nice day, and we've been inside forever. Outside sounds perfect, Naomi agreed, and was rewarded with matching grins that made her heart do something complicated. They spent the afternoon in the gardens, building elaborate fortresses from sticks and leaves, making up stories about dragons and knights. Alexander had inherited his father's intensity, throwing himself into every activity with single-minded focus. Benji was the dreamer, stopping mid-game to point out butterflies or interesting clouds, asking questions about everything. Naomi found herself charmed despite every instinct telling her not to get attached. "You're nice," Benji announced at one point. "The last nanny was mean. She was always mad at us for being too loud or too messy. But you don't seem mad at all." "Everyone's too loud or too messy sometimes," Naomi said gently. "That's just part of being human. You're not supposed to be perfect all the time. That sounds hard and boring." Benji nodded seriously, like she'd just shared profound wisdom. "I like you. You should stay forever." When David finally returned home, he found them in the library, Naomi reading from a picture book, while both boys leaned against her, eyes drooping with exhaustion, fighting sleep, even though they were clearly losing. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching, something unreadable crossing his face. "They're still alive," Naomi said quietly. "And the house is still standing. I consider that a successful day." David came further into the room, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. "They look happy. That's rare. The nanny I hired was competent but cold. She treated them like a job, not like people. They're easy to love," Naomi said without thinking, then felt her cheeks heat. "You're good with them," David said, kneeling beside the couch. "Natural. Have you thought about being a nanny professionally? The nanny didn't show up today because she quit, via text message, during the meeting. So I'm currently in need of someone who won't abandon ship." "I'm a housekeeper," Naomi reminded him. "I don't have formal training or credentials." David stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. "You have something better. You actually like my children and they clearly like you. That's worth more than any credentials. The job's yours if you want it. Better pay, better hours, actual respect instead of being treated like furniture. What do you say?" This was a terrible idea. Getting more involved with this family, with these children, with this man who looked at her like she was more than just hired help. But her mouth opened. "Yes, I'll do it." And just like that, everything changed. The first month as the twins' nanny felt like discovering a language Naomi had been speaking her entire life without realizing it. Alexander and Benji became her world in ways that terrified and thrilled her. She learned that Alexander needed exactly 3 bedtime stories, that Benji was terrified of thunder, but would never admit it. She moved into a larger room with an actual window and a bathroom she didn't have to share. David remained a complicated presence, gravitating toward the nursery in the evenings, watching from doorways as Naomi played with his sons, something unreadable in his expression. Sometimes he'd join them, awkward at first, but gradually relaxing. Those were the moments Naomi had to guard her heart most carefully. When David laughed at something Benji said, when he lifted Alexander onto his shoulders, when he looked at her with gratitude that felt dangerously close to something else. 3 months in, on a night when winter had arrived and the twins were finally asleep, David found Naomi in the library. She was reading a book from his collection, trying to improve herself. He stood in the doorway holding 2 glasses of wine, something about his posture suggesting this wasn't a casual visit. "May I join you?" he asked. And Naomi noted that he was asking, not commanding. She nodded and he settled into the chair across from her, handing her a glass. "I wanted to thank you properly. Not just for today, but for every day. You've given my son something I couldn't. Joy, stability, the feeling of being genuinely cared for. That's no small thing." "They're easy to love," Naomi said, letting that word hang between them like a confession. "I am proud," he said quietly. "But I'm also scared, terrified actually, that I'm failing them every single day. That they'll grow up and realize their father was too busy building an empire to notice them building lives." Naomi set down her wine and leaned forward, suddenly fierce. "David, stop. You're there. Maybe not every second, but you're there for the moments that matter. You tuck them in when you can. You make them breakfast on weekends. You love them so obviously it practically radiates from you. That's what they'll remember, not the hours in meetings. Trust me, I know what a bad father looks like, and you're not it. Something shifted in David's walls. How did you turn out so wise? He asked softly. Growing up the way you did, losing what you lost. Most people would be bitter. Maybe I just decided that being bitter takes more energy than being kind, and I was too tired to sustain that much rage. She took a sip of wine. Besides, your sons don't need my anger. They need someone who shows up consistently. You show up, David said, and there was something in his voice that made Naomi's heart start racing. Every day without fail, you show up and make everything better. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How valuable? David, she started, but he was already standing, already moving closer, and then he was kneeling beside her chair. I know this is complicated, he said, voice rough. I know there's a power dynamic that makes this inappropriate. I know you work for me, that we're from different worlds, that there are 1,000 reasons this is a terrible idea. But Naomi, I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting to be wherever you are. Can't stop feeling like you've become essential to my life in ways that have nothing to do with the twins. Naomi's breath caught, every logical thought screaming at her to stop this, but her hand was already reaching out, touching his face. This is a terrible idea, she whispered. The worst idea we could possibly have. I know, David said, leaning into her touch. And I don't care. Do you? She should have said yes, should have pulled back. Instead, she kissed him. And it was desperate and tender and full of all the things neither of them had been brave enough to say. When they finally pulled apart, David rested his forehead against hers. Tell me this isn't just me. I feel it, Naomi admitted. I feel everything, and it terrifies me. The next 6 months were the happiest of Naomi's life, which should have been a warning sign. She and David navigated their relationship with careful discretion, stolen moments between his meetings and her duties, nights when the twins were asleep and the house was quiet. He was gentler than she'd expected, funnier, more vulnerable when the armor came off. He told her about the weight of expectations, about growing up as the heir to a fortune he'd never asked for, about the guilt of loving his work when his wife had died giving him sons. She told him about her mother's laugh, about the scholarship she'd lost when cancer treatments drained every penny, about the foster homes that came after her father disappeared, about the years of being invisible. They traded secrets like currency, building something real and solid and terrifying. The twins adapted with the easy acceptance of children who just wanted the adults around them to be happy. They started calling Naomi by name instead of Miss Carter, started treating her like family. And if they noticed that their father smiled more now, that his hand sometimes found Naomi's when he thought they weren't looking, they never mentioned it. Then Victoria Whitmore came to visit, and everything Naomi had built came crashing down. Victoria was David's younger sister, elegant and sharp in the way only old money could produce, with perfectly highlighted hair and clothes that probably cost more than a car. She arrived on a Tuesday morning unannounced, sweeping into the house like she owned it. Naomi was playing with the twins in the garden when Victoria found them, her heels sinking into the grass. So you're the nanny David's been raving about, Victoria said, tone suggesting this wasn't a compliment. I'm Victoria, his sister. I thought it was time I met the woman who's apparently become so indispensable to my family. Naomi stood, wiping dirt from her jeans, suddenly aware of how she must look compared to Victoria's polished perfection. It's nice to meet you, she said, extending her hand. David's mentioned you. Has he? Victoria took her hand limply, barely a handshake. How lovely. And what exactly has he said? That you're very successful in real estate, that you travel frequently, and that you care deeply about the twins even if you don't see them as often as you'd like. How thoughtful. Tell me, Naomi, how long have you been working here? About 8 months, Naomi replied. First as housekeeping, now as the boy's nanny. And before that? Victoria's smile was sharp. What was your previous employment? Naomi felt the trap closing. Various jobs, retail, food service, cleaning, whatever paid the bills. So no formal education, no credentials, no experience in childcare before David so generously gave you this position. Victoria's voice was light, conversational, but her eyes were calculating. That must have been quite the stroke of luck for you, landing in a household like this. Moving from scrubbing toilets to practically raising my nephews. Some might call that opportunistic. Some might call it hard work and dedication, Naomi replied evenly, feeling anger start to simmer. I earned this position, Miss Whitmore. Your brother didn't give me anything I didn't deserve. Oh, I'm sure you earned something, Victoria said with a smile that made Naomi's stomach turn. The question is what exactly, and at what cost to this family's reputation. That night, Naomi overheard an argument that made her blood run cold. She was putting the twins to bed when raised voices from David's study drifted up through the old house's ventilation system. Victoria's sharp tones mixed with David's deeper responses. She couldn't make out every word, but enough phrases cut through to paint a devastating picture. Embarrassment to the family name. Inappropriate relationship. Taking advantage. What would Sarah think, gold digger? Naomi closed the nursery door and sank against it, heart pounding. This was it. The moment she'd been unconsciously waiting for. When reality crashed back in and reminded her that fairy tales didn't happen to girls who started out cleaning other people's houses. The next morning, David was distant in a way he hadn't been in months, answering her good morning with a distracted nod, barely looking at her over breakfast with the twins. Victoria stayed for 3 days, and each one was worse than the last. Subtle digs about Naomi's background, pointed questions about her intentions, comments about appropriate boundaries that made it clear she considered Naomi a threat to be eliminated. On the third night, David called Naomi to his office with the kind of formal summons that made her stomach drop. She found him behind his desk, Victoria standing by the window like a beautiful, vengeful angel, both of them wearing expressions that told Naomi exactly how this conversation would end. Naomi, David said, and his voice was the cold, professional tone he'd used when she first arrived, before everything changed, before she'd been stupid enough to believe she could be more than help. We need to discuss your employment here. Naomi's hands clenched at her sides. Of course, sir. She couldn't keep the slight bitterness from the sir. Victoria has raised some valid concerns about the appropriateness of our arrangement, David continued, not quite meeting her eyes. About the blurring of professional boundaries and the potential impact on the twins' well-being. After careful consideration, I've decided it's best if we return to a more traditional employer-employee relationship. No more dinners together, no more evenings in the library, no more confusion about roles and expectations. Confusion, Naomi repeated, the word tasting like ash. Is that what we're calling it now? David, look at me. Say this to my face. He finally lifted his gaze. And what she saw there broke something fundamental inside her. It was pity mixed with resignation, the look of someone who'd already made their choice and was just going through the motions. You have to understand, he said quietly. I have responsibilities to my family, to the business, to maintaining a certain standard that people expect from the Whitmore name. What we had, it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. You're the nanny, Naomi. That's all you were ever meant to be. You were just a maid, Victoria added, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Playing dress-up in a world you don't belong to, thinking you could trap a Whitmore with sentiment and proximity. But family is family, dear, and blood is blood. You'll never be one of us, no matter how many bedtime stories you read, or how many times my brother forgot himself in a moment of loneliness. Naomi felt something inside her crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. You're right, she said, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. I was just the help, just someone convenient to warm your bed and raise your children while you played at being a decent human being. She turned to David, letting him see every ounce of pain and rage she'd been holding back. Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Whitmore, that people like me should never forget our place. I won't make that mistake again. She walked out of his office with her head high, went straight to her room, and packed the same falling-apart suitcase she'd arrived with 8 months earlier. The twins were asleep, and she couldn't bear to wake them. couldn't face their questions or their tears or the way they'd beg her to stay. Instead, she wrote them a letter, telling them she loved them, that none of this was their fault, that they were perfect and brave and destined for extraordinary things. She left it on their shared dresser, next to the drawing Benji had made of the four of them as a family, the family they'd never actually been. Mrs. Reynolds found her at the service entrance an hour later, suitcase in hand, eyes red from crying. "You're making a mistake," the older woman said, and for the first time, her voice held something other than disdain. "He loves you. Whatever else is happening, he loves you." "Rich men love lots of things," Naomi replied tiredly. "They just love their reputation and their money more. Take care of those boys, Mrs. Reynolds. They deserve better than all of this." She walked down the long driveway in the dark, past the perfect hedges and the imposing gates, back out into the world where she belonged, where fairy tales didn't happen, and glass slippers were just uncomfortable shoes that gave you blisters. She had $47 in her pocket again, a broken suitcase, and a broken heart. But this time, she also had rage, cold and clarifying, the kind of anger that could be forged into purpose if she was strong enough to survive the fire. 3 years passed, and Naomi Carter disappeared into them like water into sand, deliberately, completely. She'd left the city that first night on a bus to anywhere else, ended up in Chicago through a combination of chance and desperation, found work at a tech startup that was more interested in what she could do than where she'd come from. She worked 80-hour weeks, taught herself coding and business strategy through free online courses and sheer determination, climbed from receptionist to administrative assistant to junior analyst faster than anyone expected, because she had something to prove, something to burn through the fuel of humiliation and heartbreak. The startup got bought out by a larger company, and Naomi's stock options, which she'd negotiated in lieu of higher salary because she'd learned to gamble on herself, suddenly made her wealthier than she'd ever imagined being. Not Whitmore wealthy, not old money wealthy, but enough to have choices, enough to start making plans. She cut her hair, changed her style, built armor from designer suits and confidence, transformed herself into someone who walked into rooms and demanded to be taken seriously. She started her own consulting firm, specializing in helping businesses restructure, identifying inefficiencies, finding value where others saw only failure. Within a year, she was successful. Within 2, she was becoming known in business circles as someone who could turn around supposedly hopeless situations. And all the while, she followed David's business from a distance, watched Crawford Enterprises struggle after a series of bad investments and worse decisions, saw the cracks forming in the empire he'd inherited. She didn't take pleasure in it exactly, but she didn't feel sorry for him either. He'd made his choice, and now he got to live with the consequences, just like she'd had to live with hers. She never tried to contact the twins, though she thought about them every single day, wondered if they remembered her, if they asked about the nanny who'd disappeared without saying goodbye. That guilt was a weight she carried like penance, a reminder that loving the wrong people always came with collateral damage. Then one morning, 3 years and 2 months after she'd walked away from the Whitmore estate, Naomi got a call from a lawyer named Margaret Chen, who specialized in estate planning and complex family law. "Ms. Carter, I'm calling about a matter concerning the Whitmore family, specifically regarding Sarah Whitmore's will and certain provisions that have recently come to light. I believe it would be in your interest to meet with me as soon as possible. It concerns the twins, Alexander and Benjamin, and your relationship to them." Naomi's blood ran cold. "I don't have a relationship with them," she said carefully. "I was their nanny briefly years ago. That ended." "Ms. Carter," Margaret said gently, "I think there's quite a bit you don't know about Sarah Whitmore's final wishes. Can you meet me tomorrow? My office in Chicago at 2? The meeting revealed a truth so devastating and so perfectly calibrated for revenge that Naomi felt like the universe itself was offering her a chance at vindication. Sarah Whitmore, it turned out, had been far more intelligent and far-seeing than anyone had given her credit for. Knowing her family, knowing the kind of pressure they would put on David, knowing that grief and expectation could warp even good men into making terrible choices. She'd written provisions into her will that only activated under very specific circumstances. If David remarried or entered a serious relationship within 5 years of her death with anyone from their social circle, anyone Victoria or the family approved of, the terms of the will remained standard, the estate divided traditionally. But if David, through his own actions, pushed away someone who genuinely loved him and his children, someone who had no ulterior motive and no family connection, someone the twins had bonded with, Sarah's will had a nuclear option. Full custody of the twins would go to that person, along with the family home and enough money to raise them comfortably. Sarah had left instructions with her lawyer to be opened 5 years after her death, naming criteria that would identify this person if they existed. "Naomi Carter," Margaret said quietly. "You are the only person in David Whitmore's life since Sarah's death who meets every single criterion Sarah outlined. The twins loved you. You loved them with no expectation of gain. You were dismissed by family pressure rather than any failing on your part. And you asked for nothing. Sarah wanted her sons raised by someone real, someone who would love them for themselves. She wanted to protect them from the kind of conditional love that comes with dynasty and obligation." "This can't be legal," Naomi whispered, her mind reeling. "David is their father. He's their biological father, but Sarah's estate was separate from his, inherited from her own family, and under the terms of her will, she had the right to determine custody arrangements if certain conditions were met." Margaret slid papers across the desk. "David's poor business decisions over the past 3 years have put Crawford Enterprises in serious financial trouble. He's months away from losing everything, including the house, unless he can secure emergency funding. And due to some very carefully worded clauses in their marriage agreement, he can't sell the estate without approval from Sarah's estate trustee, which, as of next month, when this will provision activates, will be you." Naomi stared at the papers, her heart pounding. "So you're telling me I could take his house, take his children, take everything, and it would be completely legal?" "Not just legal," Margaret said. "It would be honoring a dying woman's wishes for her son's well-being. But Ms. Carter, and this is important, you don't have to do this. These provisions exist to protect the twins, not to enable revenge. If you're not genuinely interested in raising Alexander and Benjamin, in being their mother in every way that matters, you should walk away now." "I never stopped wanting to be their mother," Naomi said, her voice breaking. "I think about them every day. Wonder if they're okay, if they're happy, if they remember me. But taking them from David, that's cruel. He loves them." "He does," Margaret agreed. But Sarah knew David, knew he'd cave to family pressure, knew he'd choose obligation over love if pushed hard enough. She gave you this option because she believed the twins deserved someone who would fight for them, even against their own father if necessary. The question is, are you that person? Naomi closed her eyes, seeing Alexander's intense focus, and Benji's dreamy smile, remembering bedtime stories and garden adventures, and the feeling of being part of something real for the first time in her life. Then she opened them, and met Margaret's gaze with steel in her own. "Yes," she said. "I'm that person." "When do we begin, E?" The legal documents hit David Whitmore like a freight train on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to his office where he'd been frantically trying to arrange bridge financing to save his company from collapse. He read them once, then again, then a third time, his hands shaking so badly the papers rustled. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. It was Sarah reaching from beyond the grave to punish him for sins he hadn't fully acknowledged, until they were laid out in legal language that left no room for interpretation. Naomi Carter was suing for full custody of his sons, backed by Sarah's will, supported by provisions he'd never known existed. And she was entitled to the family estate, the house he'd grown up in, the home where his children had been born. Everything was contingent on a hearing where a judge would determine whether Sarah's criteria had been met, whether he had in fact abandoned a relationship with someone who genuinely loved his children, whether he'd chosen family approval over the twins' best interests. He had 3 weeks to prepare, 3 weeks to figure out how to convince a court that he deserved to keep his sons. The hearing was held in a private room to protect the children's privacy, just the lawyers, the judge, David and Naomi, who walked in looking like someone he'd never met before. She wore a sharp charcoal suit, her hair styled differently, her whole presence radiating confidence and success. This wasn't the soft woman who'd read bedtime stories, wasn't the nervous girl who'd arrived at his door with a broken suitcase. This was someone who'd rebuilt herself from scratch and come back stronger. Someone who could meet his eyes without flinching. David's lawyer argued that biological fathers had rights, that David loved his children, that his business failures weren't relevant to his ability to parent. Naomi's lawyer, Margaret Chen, calmly presented evidence of David's emotional absence over the past 3 years, the revolving door of nannies who'd quit within months, the twins' declining grades in preschool, their increased anxiety. Then Margaret played her trump card, a video deposition from Mrs. Reynolds, who testified that she'd never seen the twins happier than during the 8 months Naomi had lived at the estate, that David had been happier too, that his decision to end the relationship had been purely about family pressure and had damaged everyone involved. But the moment that changed everything was when Judge Anderson asked to see the boys. They were brought to her chambers separately from the hearing, protected from the drama, just a friendly chat with a nice lady who asked about their favorite things. When the judge returned, her expression was grave. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "your son spoke extensively about missing Naomi. Alexander, who is 5 now, remembers her clearly. Benjamin drew her a picture that he carries everywhere, hoping he might see her again someday. They've had 7 different caregivers in 3 years, none lasting more than 6 months." She paused, letting that sink in. "While I understand this situation is complex, Sarah Whitmore's will was written to protect her children's emotional well-being, and the evidence suggests they're not thriving in the current arrangement." David felt his world collapsing. "Please," he said, abandoning pride, "please don't take my sons. I know I failed them. I know I failed Naomi. But I can change. I can do better. I can—" "Your sons need stability," Judge Anderson interrupted. "They need consistency. They need someone who puts their well-being above social expectations. The question is, can you provide that?" The compromise that emerged wasn't what anyone expected. Naomi would move into the estate, which was now legally hers through Sarah's will provisions. David would remain, paying rent to live in what had been his family home, maintaining a relationship with his sons while Naomi served as primary guardian and mother figure. They would co-parent, 2 people who'd hurt each other learning to put children first. Or the arrangement would be revisited in 6 months with the possibility of David losing all parenting rights if he couldn't demonstrate real change. It was humiliating for David, devastating, perfect revenge if that's what Naomi had been seeking. But as she moved back into the estate 3 weeks later, back into the room she'd once occupied, watching Alexander and Benji sprint toward her with screams of joy when they realized she was staying forever this time, she realized revenge had never been the point. This was about 2 little boys who deserved someone who would show up consistently, who would fight for them, who would love them without conditions or clauses. David, to his credit, didn't fight her beyond what the lawyers required. He was quiet, present for scheduled times with the twins, civil in a way that hurt more than anger would have. They existed in careful orbit around each other, sharing space but not connection, co-parents united only by their love for Alexander and Benji, until one night, 3 months into the arrangement, when Naomi found David in the library looking at the old photograph of Sarah and the newborn twins, tears running down his face. "I failed them," he said without looking up. "I failed her. She trusted me with the most important job in the world, and I chose pride over love. Chose Victoria's approval over my own children's happiness. And now I'm a guest in my own home, watching someone else give my sons what I should have given them all along." Naomi sat down across from him, feeling the old ache that had never quite healed. "You didn't fail them completely," she said quietly. "You're here. You're trying. That counts for something." David finally looked at her. "I failed you most of all. I loved you, Naomi. I still love you. But I was too cowardly to fight for us, too worried about what people would think, what Victoria would say, whether the board would question my judgment. And I lost everything that mattered trying to protect things that didn't." "Do you want to know what Sarah wrote in her letter to me?" Naomi asked. "The personal one that came with the legal documents?" David shook his head, then nodded, looking like he was bracing for another blow. She wrote that she knew David had the capacity to be extraordinary, but that he'd been trained since birth to value legacy over love. She hoped that if the circumstances in her will ever came to pass, they'd serve as his wake-up call. That losing everything would teach him what actually mattered. That you and I, broken by the same man's cowardice, might find a way to heal each other while healing her sons. "We've broken each other pretty thoroughly," David said with a bitter laugh. "I don't know if healing is possible." "Maybe not," Naomi agreed. "But we could try coexisting. Really coexisting. Not just as roommates sharing custody, but as partners in raising two incredible kids. We could try being honest with each other. No more walls. No more pretending we don't have history. We could try being friends. And maybe someday, if we're both very brave and very lucky, we could try being something more." Over the following months, they built something new from the ruins of what they'd lost, slowly, carefully, testing foundations before adding weight. They had dinner together with the twins every night, a ritual that became sacred. Alexander would recount every detail of his day with intense focus, while Benji would spin elaborate stories that started with what happened at preschool and somehow ended with dinosaurs or astronauts. David and Naomi would exchange glances over the boys' heads, small smiles that spoke of shared understanding and growing affection. They took turns with bedtime duties, coordinating schedules with the kind of precision that came from mutual respect and genuine care. Sometimes David would read the first two stories, and Naomi the third, their voices blending into a harmony that felt natural and right. They went to parent-teacher conferences and doctor's appointments as a team, sitting side by side, asking questions together, making decisions together. The teachers noticed. The doctors noticed. Even Mrs. Reynolds, who'd seen everything in her 40 years at the estate, mentioned that she'd never seen a divorced couple co-parent so effectively, prompting awkward explanations that they'd never actually been married. And late at night, when the children were asleep and the house settled into quietness, they talked, really talked, about fear and failure and the weight of expectations. They started in the library, where everything had begun and ended the first time, sitting in those same leather chairs. But gradually they moved to the kitchen for tea, to the garden for fresh air, to anywhere that felt less formal and more honest. David told her about the pressure of being a Whitmore, about growing up in this very house feeling like a museum piece on display. He spoke about his father's constant disappointment, how nothing David achieved was ever quite enough, how the old man had died still believing his son was too soft for the business world. He talked about his mother's emotional coldness, the way she'd raised him to value appearance over authenticity, reputation over relationships, and he spoke about Victoria's manipulation that he'd been too weak to recognize, how she'd played on his grief and his fear, how she'd made him believe that honoring Sarah's memory meant rejecting anyone who came after her. Naomi told him about the years after she'd left, and not just the success story she'd become, but the hard parts in between. She spoke about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep in a hostel, about the job she'd taken that paid under the table because she had no references, about the morning she'd woken up and realized she had a choice between staying bitter or becoming better. She told him about building herself back up from nothing, about the satisfaction and hollowness of professional success, about the anger that had fueled her rise like rocket fuel, but left her alone at the summit. And she spoke about the loneliness that had accompanied her success, how she'd learned to have business meals with powerful people but forgotten how to have dinner with friends, how she'd mastered the art of negotiation, but lost the ability to be vulnerable. Gradually, imperceptibly, the space between them began to close. A hand brushed during dinner, and instead of pulling away, they let the touch linger for just a moment longer. A shared laugh over one of Benji's elaborate stories about a robot who wanted to be a baker turned into genuine eye contact, the kind that made Naomi's heart skip and David's breath catch. David's automatic movement to catch Naomi when she slipped on ice walking to the car became an embrace that lasted longer than necessary, both of them acutely aware of how perfectly they fit together, how right it felt to be held and to hold. The twins noticed, of course. Children always notice these things before adults are ready to admit them. Alexander asked one morning over breakfast, "Are you and Naomi going to be boyfriend and girlfriend now, Dad?" with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. Benji added, Because that would be really good. I don't like it when grown-ups are sad, and you both seem less sad now. David had looked at Naomi across the table, a question in his eyes, and she'd felt her defenses crumbling. We're working on being friends first, Naomi had said carefully. Is that okay with you guys? I guess, Alexander had said with a shrug. But friends who love each other and live together are basically just married people, so you're not fooling anyone. The wisdom of 5-year-olds apparently was not to be underestimated. Small moments that accumulated into something neither of them dared name became impossible to ignore. Naomi caught herself watching David play with the boys in the garden, his suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, rolling in the grass like he'd forgotten to be dignified. David found himself timing his arrivals home to coincide with the twins' dinner, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see Naomi's face light up when she laughed at one of Alexander's jokes. They started leaving notes for each other, reminders about appointments at first, then little observations about the boys, then finally small jokes and references to their late-night conversations. The notes began appearing on the coffee maker, on bathroom mirrors, tucked into books they were reading. Each one was a tiny declaration. Neither was brave enough to make out loud yet, until Victoria made her inevitable reappearance 6 months into the arrangement, showing up unannounced and furious about family disgrace and legal overreach. She found them in the garden with the twins, all 4 of them building an elaborate fort from branches and determination, covered in dirt and completely happy. This is absurd, Victoria announced. David, you're letting your sons be raised by a woman who was hired help, living in your family home like some kind of charity case or worse, like she actually belongs here. It's embarrassing. It's pathetic. You need to fight this ridiculous arrangement and take back control of your own family. David stood slowly, and Naomi saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Clarity mixed with determination, and something that looked a lot like liberation. Victoria, he said calmly, you need to leave. This isn't your home. These aren't your children. And your opinion about my life stopped mattering the moment you convinced me to throw away the best thing that ever happened to me. Victoria's eyes widened. You can't be serious. I'm your sister. You were my sister, David corrected. Now you're someone who prioritizes social status over human decency. Someone who would rather see children raised by emotionally distant nannies than by a woman who loves them. Someone I don't particularly like or want in my sons' lives. So you need to go. And you need to not come back unless you can treat Naomi with the respect she deserves. After Victoria left in a fury of designer heels and wounded pride, David turned to Naomi. I should have done that 3 years ago, he said quietly. Should have told her where to go, should have fought for you. For us. I'm sorry it took losing everything to figure out what actually mattered. Naomi looked at him, at the man who'd broken her heart and been broken in return, who'd lost his empire and found his soul somewhere in the rubble. The twins were watching them with interest, Benji holding Alexander's hand like he always did when adults got emotional. I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately, David continued. I'm not asking you to pretend the past didn't happen, or that I didn't hurt you beyond measure. But I'm asking if maybe, possibly, we could start over. Not as employer and employee, not as guardian and tenant, but as 2 people who love the same children trying to figure out if they could love each other too. We already loved each other, Naomi said, her voice thick with emotion. That was never the question. The question was whether you were brave enough to choose that love over everything else trying to pull you away from it. David took her hands in his. I'm brave enough now. It took losing everything, took being humiliated and humbled, took watching you build a life without me and realizing I wanted nothing more than to be part of it again. I'm brave enough now, Naomi. The question is, are you brave enough to give me another chance? Naomi looked at their joined hands, then at the twins, then back at David. She thought about the girl who'd arrived 3 years ago with a broken suitcase and broken dreams, thought about the woman she'd become through fire and determination, thought about the fact that real strength wasn't refusing to be vulnerable, but choosing to be vulnerable with the right person. I'm terrified, she admitted. But yes, I'm brave enough to try. I'm brave enough to. The kiss they shared tasted like second chances and earned redemption, witnessed by two little boys who cheered and immediately demanded that this meant there would be a wedding with cake. 1 year later, there was indeed a wedding. Small and intimate in the garden where Naomi had first played with the twins, where Alexander had climbed impossible trees and Benji had asked his 4,000 questions. Victoria wasn't invited. David's parents, who'd finally accepted that their son had found happiness outside their carefully constructed expectations, attended with stiff smiles that gradually warmed as they watched their grandsons dance with joy. Mrs. Reynolds cried. Margaret Chen gave a speech about unlikely victories, and the twins served as ring bearers with solemn responsibility that lasted until Benji tripped and sent both rings flying into the flowers, setting off a hilarious search that involved half the guests. "You were just a maid," David said during their first dance, smiling as he quoted Victoria's cruel words. "Just the help, playing dress-up. And now you own my house, have custody of my children, and somehow convinced me to marry you. It's the greatest con in history." Naomi laughed, resting her head against his chest. "Not a con," she corrected. "Just proof that sometimes the underdog wins, that sometimes fairy tales happen to the least likely people, and that love is always worth fighting for. Even when fighting means losing everything first so you can find what actually matters." The twins crashed into them mid-dance, demanding to be lifted, and they obliged, swaying together as a family, imperfect and hard-won and absolutely real. Alexander and Benji, now 6 and full of opinions, had designed their own bow ties and insisted on making speeches at the reception about how happy they were that Naomi was officially their mom now, even though she'd always been their mom in the ways that mattered. Later that night, after the guests had left and the twins were finally asleep, David and Naomi stood on the balcony of their shared bedroom, looking out over the estate that had been the setting for so much pain and transformation. "She did it," David said quietly. "Sarah. She knew exactly what needed to happen. Knew I'd fail first and needed the chance to do better. Knew you were strong enough to survive being pushed away and brave enough to come back when it mattered. She gave us all the greatest gift, the permission to start over. She gave the twins a mother who would fight for them," Naomi corrected. "Everything else was just a happy accident." David pulled her closer. "The happiest accident of my life." They stood there together as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who'd been broken and rebuilt, who'd lost everything and found it again in each other. The mansion behind them was no longer David's family legacy, but Naomi's hard-won victory, purchased with 3 years of determination and vindicated by a dead woman's wisdom. The twin boys sleeping inside were theirs together, raised by love instead of obligation, protected by someone who'd once scrubbed these floors and now owned them entirely. And if anyone ever dared to suggest that Naomi Carter Whitmore was anything less than she deserved to be, they'd face not just her fury but David's, and the combined force of two people who'd learned that real power isn't inherited or purchased, but earned through surviving everything designed to break you and choosing love anyway. "You were just a maid." Those words had been meant to wound, to diminish, to put her back in her place. Instead, they'd become her origin story. The reminder that she'd started with nothing and built everything. That she'd been dismissed and come back triumphant. That the impossible victory was always sweetest when everyone had bet against you. Years later, when Alexander and Benji were older and asked about how their parents had gotten together, Naomi would tell them the truth. All of it. The good and the terrible, and the complicated parts in between. She'd tell them about mistakes and second chances, about pride and redemption, about their mother Sarah's extraordinary wisdom in creating an escape hatch for love when traditional paths failed. And she'd tell them the most important lesson of all, that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. That being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage, and that the people who try to make you feel small are usually the ones most afraid of your potential greatness. The twins absorbed these lessons, growing up with the kind of confidence that comes from being genuinely loved, from seeing their parents work through difficulty together, from understanding that strength means admitting when you're wrong and having the courage to make it right. The story of how a maid became the mistress of the manor, how humiliation transformed into vindication, how two broken people became whole through the shared project of raising two beautiful children, became family legend. But more than that, It became proof that sometimes the universe conspires to give you exactly what you deserve, even if you have to walk through fire to claim it. Even if the path there breaks your heart before it can heal it. Even if victory looks nothing like what you originally imagined. Naomi Carter had arrived at the Whitmore estate with $47 and a broken suitcase. Dismissed as help, and told she'd never be more. She'd left with nothing but rage and determination, rebuilt herself from scratch in the fires of ambition and anger, and returned to claim not just the house, but the family. Not just victory, but love. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Not hurting the people who'd hurt her, but proving them wrong in every possible way. Building a life so full and joyous and real that their small-minded cruelty became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story of triumph. And they all lived, if not happily ever after, because life is never that simple, then at least honestly ever after, which turned out to be so much better.